Iran, 1971, a country sitting on one of the largest oil reserves on Earth, and yet, in its villages, people went to bed hungry. This is the story of one of the most extravagant parties in human history, and of how a single celebration helped destroy a throne that had stood for centuries. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi came to power in 1941, not through revolution or inheritance alone, but through foreign intervention. Britain and the Soviet Union jointly occupied Iran and installed him. His most powerful patron, however, would soon become the United States. He survived an assassination attempt in 1949. After that, he tightened his grip. His secret police, Savak, became one of the most feared intelligence services in the world. But to dismiss him as simply a brutal autocrat would miss something important. The Shah genuinely believed in modernization. He built power stations, factories, universities. He stood at the founding of OPEC and leveraged Iran's oil wealth to fund an ambitious transformation of the country. The problem was the execution. Power stations were built where there were no engineers to run them. Factories were constructed with no workforce to staff them and no market to buy their products. Money flooded the economy and produced not prosperity, but inflation. Shah's Iran resembled a giant workshop full of brand new parts that no one could assemble into anything coherent. And while gleaming infrastructure rose in the cities, in the countryside, many Iranians still lacked access to clean drinking water. His land reform, the centerpiece of his modernization agenda, largely failed. The rapid urbanization it triggered outpaced any planning. Workers flooded into Tehran and lived in mud-brick slums on the city's outskirts because no one had thought to build them housing. Resentment grew, and at its head stood a theology professor and preacher from Qom, Ruhollah Khomeini. His criticism of the Shah wove together the religious and the political. Corruption, authoritarianism, Western subservience, moral degeneracy. Many Iranians found his message deeply compelling. Into this atmosphere of simmering anger, the Shah decided to throw the most spectacular party the modern world had ever seen. In 1971, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi announced that Iran would celebrate the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire, dating back to Cyrus the Great and the Achaemenid dynasty. Founded around 550 BC, the Shah ran his own imperial calendar separate from both the Islamic calendar and the Western one. In his reckoning, this was a civilizational milestone of the highest order. The location chosen was Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the ancient Persian kings. Burned by Alexander the Great in 330 BC and abandoned for 2.5 millennia. Even in ruins, it was breathtaking. Towering columns, carved reliefs of tribute bearers and royal guards, the bones of an empire that once stretched from Egypt to India. This was where the Shah would show the world what Iran was and what it was becoming. Preparations took a full year. The Shah's court minister, Asadullah Alam, oversaw the operation personally in constant communication with the empress. The logistical challenge was staggering. The nearest major city, Shiraz, was over 40 kilometers away. The airport had to be expanded. The highway had to be rebuilt. The surrounding desert had to be cleared, not just of rocks and sand, but of snakes and scorpions. Dispatched with industrial quantities of pesticide, and then the city had to be built. A tented village rose from the desert beside the ruins. Not camping, but what we might now call ultra-luxury glamping. Designed by a Parisian design firm with nearly a century of history. Each tent was divided into a bedroom, sitting room, bathroom, and servants' quarters. Furnished to the standard of a 5-star hotel, the tents were arranged in a star pattern around a central fountain. At the center was a grand reception tent for the most important guests. And at the heart of it all, a banquet hall measuring 68 by 24 meters. The catering contract went to Maxim's of Paris, one of the most celebrated restaurants of the 20th century. The restaurant closed for 2 weeks to service the event. 160 chefs, bakers and waiters flew in from France, accompanied by 4 tons of meat, a ton of seafood, and thousands of bottles of wine. Giant ice cubes followed. The menu featured quail eggs stuffed with Caspian caviar, crayfish mousse in white wine sauce, and roasted stuffed quail served beneath. And this detail is almost too perfect. Taxidermied peacocks posed as if presiding over the feast. 15,000 trees were imported from Europe, along with banks of flowers and 70,000 birds. Most of the birds and trees would die in the desert heat after the guests left. That was understood. That was acceptable. The guest list reads like a directory of 1971's global power structure. Monarchs arrived from Bahrain, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, Nepal, and a dozen other nations. Crown princes came from Italy, Japan, and Greece. Prince Philip represented Britain. The vice president represented the United States. Imelda Marcos brought her daughter. A cardinal came from the Vatican. The chairman of the Bundestag attended. There were 18 presidents in total and roughly 15 monarchs, not counting dozens of foreign ministers and ambassadors. Perhaps the most pointed invitation went to Nikolai Podkorny, chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, the nominal head of state of the USSR. His presence was a diplomatic signal aimed squarely at Washington. Iran has options. Don't take us for granted. Equally pointed were the absences: Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Syria, all of which resented Iran's ambitions to dominate the Persian Gulf, declined to send senior representatives. Guests were transported from Shiraz airport in a motorcade of 250 Mercedes limousines. Inside their tents, each found a surprise: a hand-woven tapestry bearing their own portrait, alongside a welcome of refreshments. The most eccentric guest was almost certainly Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, a widower who arrived without a wife but with a small dog wearing a diamond-studded collar. The dog, by most accounts, was better dressed than several heads of state. The official celebrations opened on October 12, 1971, not at Persepolis, but at Pasargadae, the older of the ancient Persian capitals, home to the tomb of Cyrus the Great himself. The Shah stood before the tomb and spoke. He promised to honor and continue the legacy of Cyrus, a king who 25 centuries earlier had issued what some historians consider history's first declaration of human rights: the Cyrus cylinder. The original artifact, normally housed in the British Museum, had been loaned to Iran specifically for this occasion. As the Shah concluded his speech and a minute of silence was observed, something unrehearsed happened. A gust of wind swept across the plain, lifting sand from around the ancient tomb into the air. No one had planned it. Everyone noticed it. That evening, as guests arrived at the tented city, the highway from Shiraz was illuminated by enormous oil flares, a reminder, if one were needed, of exactly where the money was coming from. On the 14th of October, the formal banquet took place. 600 guests dined in a spectacle that lasted hours. Afterwards, they were led into the ruins of Persepolis itself for a sound and light show, then a novelty, projecting the history of the empire onto ancient stones. A fireworks display followed that reportedly lit up the desert sky for miles. The climax came the next day, a military parade through Persepolis unlike anything staged in the modern era. 1,200 Iranian soldiers, costumed with obsessive historical accuracy based on archaeological finds, frescoes and ancient texts, represented 2,500 years of Persian civilization, Achaemenid immortals, Parthian cavalry, Sassanid warriors, medieval Persian armies, right up to the modern imperial guard. They marched on horseback, camel, and chariot. A full-scale siege tower was hauled through the ruins. The whole spectacle was broadcast live on television across Iran and around the world. The official celebration closed in Tehran, where the Shah unveiled a new monument, a 45-meter white marble arch, today known as the Azadi Tower, still the first thing many visitors see when arriving in the Iranian capital. Then the Shah visited the tomb of his father, Reza Shah the Great, and the festivities were over. Abroad, the reaction was admiration. The world's press marveled at the spectacle. Foreign dignitaries spoke in glowing terms of Iranian hospitality and civilization. Inside Iran, the reaction was rage. The Shah officially stated the cost at around $17 million. The real figure, as journalists investigated and estimates multiplied, grew to somewhere between $100 and $300 million in $1,971. In a country where rural families went hungry, where factory workers lived in slums, where the promises of modernization had produced inflation and dislocation more than genuine prosperity, the sight of foreign royalty feasting on French caviar in the desert was an insult that could not be absorbed quietly. The deliberate exclusion of ordinary Iranians made it worse. Aside from soldiers in costume, no Iranian citizens were invited. The roads were sealed. Universities were closed for the duration. Hundreds of political suspects were arrested preemptively, just in case. At one checkpoint, the King of Denmark was briefly detained by mistake, a rare moment of unintentional democratization. Khomeini did not let the moment pass. He condemned the celebrations as satanic as a desecration of Islam, as proof that the Shah served foreign masters and cared nothing for his own people. Across Iran, many agreed. 8 years later, the Islamic Revolution swept the Pahlavi dynasty from power. The Shah fled into exile in 1979 and died the following year. there. A man without a country. The golden tent city at Persepolis was torn apart. The rusted metal frames are still there, visible from the road, half buried in the desert. The ruins of Persepolis endure as one of Iran's most visited archaeological sites, a reminder of genuine ancient glory. The tent poles are a different kind of monument to the hubris of a man who thought he could buy his place in history with a party. In a country where millions had nothing at all,